Today we are going to be looking at Thomas Paine's Common Sense and Thomas Jefferson's ideas in the Declaration of Independence. They are both arguing that the colonies should become their own nation, separate from Britain, and we're going to kind of look at how their ideas are similar and how their ideas are different. We're going to go ahead and start with Thomas Paine's Common Sense. I have a few quotes from Common Sense here. The first one is, "We have boasted the protection of Great Britain without considering that her motive was interest, not attachment, and that she did not protect us from our enemies on our account, but from her enemies on her own account." So basically, what Paine is arguing here is that this idea of Britain and the colonies being separate is an idea that originated from the British, not necessarily in their words, but in their deeds. As we could see in their actions during the French and Indian War, as well as their institution of the Intolerable Acts, we can see that Britain is separating itself and making the colonies a separate entity from Britain. The second quote here is, "Tell me whether you can hereafter love, honor, and faithfully serve the power that hath carried fire and sword into your land. If you cannot do all of these, then you are only deceiving yourselves, and by your delay bringing ruin upon posterity." What Paine is doing here is he is appealing to the Enlightenment. He's appealing to logic. He's appealing to the rationalism that is very, very relevant in the colonies. He says, if you cannot do these, then you are only deceiving yourselves. This if then statement is a rich pull from the Enlightenment and from the rationalism. So it would have been a very compelling argument to say that logically the colonies ought to separate from Britain. The third quote I have here is, "He hath shown himself such an inveterate enemy to liberty, and discovered such a thirst for arbitrary power. Is he or is he not a proper man to say to these colonies, you shall make no laws but what I please?" So not only is Paine arguing that Britain started this separation, he's not only arguing that this is a logical step in the right direction, he's also arguing here that it's a moral decision, right? This king is an evil tyrant, and we ought to separate ourselves from him. If he is making allowing for no laws except for what benefits him, that is a moral issue for Paine. Next, we're going to dive into Jefferson's ideas coming out of the Declaration of Independence. So I have another three quotes from Jefferson here. The first one is, "To secure these rights," Jefferson is talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, "governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed." This idea of the consent of the governed is another huge idea coming out of the Enlightenment, specifically from John Locke. John Locke was an influential figure who impacted a lot of the founding fathers with his second treatise of government, in which he writes, "Men being, as has been said, by nature, all free, equal, and independent, no one can put out of this estate and be subjected to the political power of another without his own consent." So this is a very Lockean idea that people ought to govern themselves. People ought to do what is best for their own interest because they know their interest better than an outside power. So basically, what Jefferson is arguing is that the colonists are not being governed by their own consent. They're being taxed. They are having to house soldiers and quarter soldiers against their will, and this is not what a successful government would look like. Another quote from Jefferson is, "For taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments." So basically, in the Declaration, you have the first part, which is kind of an intro. Then you have a list of a ton of reasons why they are declaring independence from Britain. This is one of those reasons. The King George is abolishing their laws and their forms of government. He is making it impossible for them to govern themselves. So he's really owning in on this idea of the consent of the governed throughout the document. The final quote, we'll see he sticks to that focus. The third quote is, "We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us." So once again, Jefferson is really, really appealing to this Lockean idea of the consent of the governed, and he is really making that his focal point of the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Paine does address that, so that is similar, but Thomas Paine has a much more varied argument saying that this is a rational decision, this is a moral decision, and this is a decision that Britain originated themselves.